Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to Voices of Liberty. Today we have a very special guest. He's a friend of the channel and a friend of Liberty, and he's also a contributor to VOL. Ben Swann. Ben, glad to have you with us today.
Dr. Paul, thanks for having me with you.
Now, you've been involved a good while in the freedom movement, and of course, many of the libertarian freedom movement people heard about you during the last campaign, and you were very active in talking about some of the things we were talking about in the campaign. But you've been staying busy, and you're doing a lot of work. But would you start off with updating us what's been going on, since you're not on a daily TV station, but daily I know you're working very hard. But let us know what you've been doing.
Well, there's definitely a difference between, the day-to-day news cycle and being involved in that, which I do miss to some extent, versus what we're doing now, which are longer format pieces. They take more time to develop. I'm excited about what we're doing. I was watching last night CNN, for instance, and saw that they've just hired Jay Carney. He's their new GIT over at CNN. And I'm watching this, shaking my head, saying, you got Jay Carney, you've got Newt Gingrich, and they're debating back and forth news of the day. I mean, where's the journalism involved in any of this? And I know Jay Carney used to be a journalist, but he's not a journalist anymore. The guy's a professional spin doctor on behalf of this administration. And so I'm glad to be able to do what I'm doing right now. We're developing longer format pieces, specifically on ISIS and militarization of police. We think they're very important issues.
Now, I didn't happen to see that CNN program, but I saw a write-up that said that he had a little confrontation with, McCain. And somebody was accusing another one of lying. And I got to thinking, well, which side is accusing each other? Because I think both sides of that argument that was going on had been trained in at least deception, in the media. But that must have been some debate that went on on CNN last night.
Well, it was, and let me just say, I did see that. They called it the Carney-McCain showdown. But here's what's amazing about it. The showdown was between McCain and Carney over whether or not the U.S. should have or really needed to pull forces out of Iraq. And so they were debating back and forth. But their final conclusion was the same, which is that in a perfect world, the U.S. would never have left Iraq. Carney is saying we should have stayed, but we didn't have this use of forces agreement, so we couldn't. McCain was saying we could have gotten that agreement, and we didn't. And that was the big debate. Instead of saying, oh, really, so we're going to perpetually keep U.S. troops in Iraq forever, because as soon as we leave, because of the hole we've blown into the political and physical structure there, it's going to ultimately be filled by some kind of violent element, which we are, as you know, Dr. Paul, radicalizing around the world through continued drone strikes and bombings in Syria and in Yemen and in Pakistan and all over the Middle East. So none of the debate was about anything of substance. It was just talking points between these two sides who ultimately agree on the same thing.
And that makes the point that you made at the beginning of this conversation, that how would anybody expect to get much news out of that type of conversation, that type of reporting? But, we all have heard the term and used it frequently, the military-industrial complex. Less frequently, there are people who will use the military or the state media industrial complex. Is that a fair term to use? And if so, how does that come about and why?
That's a really good question and a very good point. I think it's absolutely there is a media industrial complex. I mean, when you consider the fact that in the United States we have about 6 major companies that own really all of major media, and with the discussion right now between Comcast and Time Warner possibly consolidating together, we'd have even fewer. Rupert Murdoch, who owns News Corp and 20th Century Fox, wanting to buy Time Warner, and so we see the ever shrinking kind of pot, if you will, of media in this country. And remember, media is more than just news. As you know, Dr. Paul, we're talking about cinema, we're talking about television shows. All of it is sending messages on a regular basis to people around the world and in the United States about very important issues, and it controls the way people think. That doesn't mean that it's brainwashing. But media sends messages. It constantly sends them. And so as we see the consolidation of media, what we find is that when you are a journalist, speaking candidly here, when you're a journalist who asks questions, most media doesn't want you to ask questions. And most media and media managers and media companies are very uncomfortable with the idea that you question the narrative that's in place. They're trying to please advertisers. They're trying to please politicians. They're trying to please friends with all kinds of political and business connections. And so they don't want questions being asked.
Ben, I wanted to ask you a question about the 9/11 Commission. I'm sure you've seen all the activity there and the work of Walter Jones trying to make sure that we get all the information. And once again, there's a commission designed to hide what the government did, not to expose it. But how do you look at that? And have you been talking much about the 9/11 Commission reports?
Yeah, absolutely, we have, and in fact, we had a piece just recently talking about the 9/11 Commission reports and the activity that attempting to declassify those 28 pages and wanting to see that happen. And guys like Congressman Thomas Massey, who's been pushing for this, and as you mentioned, Walter Jones pushing for this, who are saying, look, there are 28 pages in this report that should be declassified so that the American people can see it. Now, listen, there are people who are watching right now who will say, hey, that's a smokescreen. Don't listen to that because that's not what really happened, and they have their own theory. And that's fine. The bottom line is we need more information. And when there is information directly in front of us that the government refuses to release, and members of Congress are saying this will completely shift what you think happened on 9/11, it needs to be released to the public, if for no other reason that even if you don't believe that particular version, it is important that the American people have the ability to start questioning. Because remember, as you know, Dr. Paul, we can't even question 9/11. Even as a journalist, I can't even tell you how many times I have been criticized. A year ago, we did a piece just saying there's a group called Rethink 9/11 that questions how the third building fell down. And by even mentioning it, you're seen as being, a kook, a nut job, a conspiracy theorist. At the end of the day, no matter what version of events you believe about 9/11, if you believe it happened, you believe in a conspiracy. Somebody conspired to commit those acts. What's important is that we see the evidence of what we know, and we begin to go through that evidence with critical minds. Journalists are not doing it. There are a few brave politicians who are pushing for it, brave people such as yourself who are calling for it. It needs to happen. It's critically important that it happens because remember, 12, 13, 14, 15 years later, we are still engaged in wars around the world with hundreds of thousands of civilians dying and thousands of U.S. troops dying and trillions of dollars being spent for what? And it all stems back to that morning on September 11th of 2001. It is critical that we talk about these issues.